remember shooting Pitch Black, and I remember thinking, there is some place to go with this character.
Sometimes a movie goes for something more than good, more than great, but legendary, striving not for the mundane, but the extraordinary.
The possibilities of exploring Riddick's world just kept haunting me.
Most of the time, though, it fails, succumbing to the same fate that plagues oh so many films. But it's that ambition that makes it memorable, that separates it from those with much smaller aspirations.
I remember telling everybody that Riddick was going to come back, but this time we were going to follow Riddick into his universe.
Such is the case for the Riddick franchise, which has an evolution unlike anything else, switching both its genre and its medium from one installment to the next, expanding and reducing the scope of its story, the scale of its setting, shifting from a planet to a spaceship to a galaxy.
I knew the trap the other sequels had fallen into, about kind of replaying the same thing over and over again. So I said, I think the key to it is not to do the expected. Don't go back to the same planet. Don't meet the same creatures. Don't even let it be a creature movie. Could we change genres? Could you go from horror science fiction to science fiction adventure and yet keep the same tone and keep the same characters?
Though it eventually blossomed into a full-blown franchise, it started out as a single film that eventually ended up having a much bigger impact than anyone expected, introducing a character whose cool factor not only separated him from the rest of his cast, but also paved the way for both his actor and his screenwriter to build an entire universe around him, gambling their own time and money on a saga centered around his adventures. While the first installment, Pitch Black, doesn't focus on him quite to the inseparable degree as the following films, it still establishes this fixation on him as the singular linking piece of the franchise, made abundantly clear with the inclusion of his name in each successive title. You see, despite expanding the universe, introducing new characters, races, technology, and ideas, ultimately, the Riddick franchise is about Riddick, the story forming around his adventures, and as he makes his way from one situation to the next, the genre follows, adapting to the setting, the threat, the characters, causing each film to have its own distinct feel, starting off with horror. In Riddick's first adventure, Pitch Black, he encounters deadly mercenaries, mutilated corpses, and carnivorous aliens. But despite these dark elements appearing all throughout the runtime, the film's horror becomes most apparent during the setting typically associated with the genre, the night. And as its title suggests, the film sets many of its scenes at this time, the entire second half in fact. Before we get there though, during the day, the film finds excuses to darken the setting, placing characters in long corridors that block out the light, illustrating how heavily the film relies on darkness to evoke fear. That even during the day, it removes the light. The darkness in the film feels like a character, a threat unto itself, turning its opposite, the light, into a symbol of hope, whose presence removes the sense of fear. A simple flame projects safety, but only until it fades away, the amount of light directly influencing the feeling of danger in each scene, with more light creating relief. However, you can divide Pitch Black into two halves, day and then night, with each half conveying the emotions that the most dominant visuals suggest. You see, in the first half of the film, before darkness arrives, the film doesn't generally feel like horror, the abundance of light restraining the sense of fear necessary for the genre. With the exception of a few scenes set in the dark, the first half feels more like a sci-fi mystery, slowly raising questions, ones whose answers ultimately align with the film's tone after the midpoint. Halfway through though, Pitch Black begins to reveal those answers, which shifts the film's tone into what its title implies. It becomes darker, and we no longer ask what the threat is, we witness it, seeing what it can do firsthand. And it's the subject matter here that the filmmakers really lean into. They plainly present horror elements, showing the grotesque alien violence without subverting expectations. Even without context, without relying on unnatural presentation or distorted imagery, simply seeing these creatures induces fear. Their form uncanny, their movement hypnotizing. And the film takes advantage of these inherent effects of their design, supplementing them with eerie sounds and the careful placement of light that leaves the frame largely dark and therefore threatening, but without sacrificing the clarity of the image so we can still tell what's happening. Pitch Black is horror, even though it doesn't always feel like it, and it's this horror that defines the film, but also what separates it from the rest of the franchise. Following Pitch Black, the next feature film in the franchise is The Chronicles of Riddick, which explores Riddick through a far more magnified lens, while placing him in a grand adventure, traveling from one planet to the next, facing enemies whose reach surpasses the distance between stars. Working with such an epic outline, the creators of The Chronicles of Riddick populated the world with finer details that support the ideas raised by the broader story elements to form a consistent genre, even though it contrasted with the previous installment. You see, whereas Pitch Black fits in sci-fi horror, The Chronicles of Riddick almost entirely removes the horror part and aligns much more closely with sci-fi fantasy or adventure, implementing magic, prophecies, and futuristic technology, elements more commonly associated with those genres. However, turning the main character of the previous film into the dominant focus of this one creates some overlap between the two stories, Riddick's character permeating the tone of each one, adding that cool factor to both Pitch Black and The Chronicles of Riddick, with perhaps my favorite visual of his aura being this hilarious shot that illustrates how dangerous he is. Like, why do they need so many guns on him? While the tone and genre as a whole evolve from one installment to the next, these little expressions of Riddick's character link the franchise together, not only for what we see, but how it makes us feel. That is to say, it's not just that he appears in every film, but the effect that appearance has on the audience that returns every time, including the franchise's small screen adventure whose story just couldn't fit in The Chronicles of Riddick.
There's not enough time in 2 hours to explain the universe. So we have to add something that helps to explain or further uncover this universe.
The Chronicles of Riddick begins several years after the events of Pitch Black, creating a gap between the two drastically different stories. But instead of simply leaving it open to interpretation, they decided to fill it in.
You have Pitch Black and you have Chronicles of Riddick. They're very different. So for me, this was the thing that helps explain that.
The thing is, though, they didn't really need to explain this period of time between the two feature films. The Chronicles of Riddick answers enough questions to keep the viewer informed enough for its story, choosing to exclude much of the background and leaving it as little more than implication. But what's unimportant in one film may be crucial in another, turning unaddressed details into the focal point of a new story and allowing for an entirely different approach, perhaps even going from real life to animation. In other words, The Chronicles of Riddick, Dark Fury. This is Peter Chung, the director of Dark Fury. He and his team worked overtime to bring forth yet another distinct atmosphere to the franchise, one that also supported the universe and story they had already established and would later continue. This time, though, they manipulated the medium itself, drawing the frames by hand instead of capturing them on celluloid.
It's a very long and slow process.
Only about 30 minutes long, Dark Fury presents a short tale, but its style looms large, with Chung's designs maintaining the spirit of the original characters while exaggerating their proportions and going even further during the climax, turning them into full-on caricatures. Despite the different medium though, Dark Fury's visual style shares many similarities with that of Pitch Black, most notably the use of color, incorporating vibrant tones and dark scenes to create an array of monochromatic images. Dark Fury's story, however, aligns more closely with the world introduced in the Chronicles of Riddick, suggesting the existence of a much larger, more complex universe. Its use of action feels like a combination of the two films, implementing the sporadic darkness of Pitch Black with the kinetic movement of the Chronicles of Riddick. Dark Fury doesn't simply explain the time between Pitch Black and the Chronicles of Riddick. It combines the two stories, transitioning from the isolated survival horror of the first feature film into the grandiose adventure fantasy of the second. And it doesn't simply mix the subject matter, but the styles too, fusing different aspects of each film's presentation while also introducing its own elements, ultimately creating another entry that feels quite unlike anything else. The franchise achieves this evolution of genre without sacrificing clarity by leading with its main character, whose energy persists in every installment, even when it intertwines with other conflicts and characters to create unique interactions. But every time it does, it always contains that unmistakable Riddick. Thanks for watching.